used float right to get those buttons over there on the right. Something is still bothering me about that, though. If you look at this LI, you see that the label, the name, is not centered vertically inside there. And that's just sloppy looking. I don't like it. So I want to fix it. Vertical alignment in CSS is shockingly hard to do. There are a lot of different ways you can sort of do it. Very few of which are reliable. They work sometimes, like using line height and stuff like that. There is a CSS property called vertical alignment that you can set to middle that almost never works. It works under very certain circumstances, depending on whether you use positioning. But what I'm going to use is something fairly recent called Flexbox, which is a whole new way of laying things out that is really nice and makes a few things that were just plain not possible before possible, and some other things that were possible much easier, including vertical alignment. Browser support is pretty good. It does not go way back, but there are polyfills for some of the older browsers. Have I used the term polyfills in here again? So I think the name actually comes from a brand of spackling, because it does what spackling does. It fills in holes. So if you use a newer feature that a certain browser doesn't support, if someone has written a polyfill for that feature, then you can just add a script to the page, and it will find every place you use that and basically use JavaScript to attempt to emulate the correct behavior in a browser that doesn't actually do that thing. So let's use Flexbox. We're not going to go into a ton of depth because it's pretty complicated. It's not necessarily difficult, but it's more complicated than we want to get into here. CSS Tricks has a pretty good guide to Flexbox. Flexbox.io, aka What the Flexbox, is from the same guy who did JavaScript 30, Wes Boss. And that's another free video course that's pretty darn good. And you lay out some kind of interesting things with it. And over the course of building these 20 small things, you sort of get the idea of most of the basics of Flexbox. What we're going to do with it is really quite simple. So the first thing I want to do is tell it that each LI should be a Flexbox. It should use that kind of layout. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this. So I'm going to add a rule. Dino here, that's each LI, right? So I can just say display flex. Other values of display would be things like block, inline block, none, of course. Table, there are a bunch of others. But display flex will basically turn Flexbox on for this. And then some of the rules related to Flexbox apply to the container, and some apply to the items inside the container. We can get a couple of things accomplished by using Flexbox that would be hard otherwise. Vertical alignment is one of them. Another one is if you look at the span, it takes up only that tiny little, it's only as wide as the words that are in there, right? It'd be nice if it took up all the space except for what the buttons are taking up. And we have no great way of doing that without using floats, and we don't want to use floats because they're weird. So Flexbox actually makes that pretty easy. If you read about things here, we have properties for the parent, properties for the children. On the children, we have flex grow. Defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary. Accepts a unitless value that serves as a proportion, dictating what amount of the available space inside the flex container the item should take up. So if there's extra space, if all of the items that are in there don't fill the whole thing, and they don't right now, then you can use flex grow to make one of them take up what's remaining, or to have it distributed evenly. If we put flex 1 or flex grow 1 on both actions and the span, then they would both take up an equal amount of the remaining space. But we only want that to happen to the name. So I'm going to put dino name, which was the name of that span, right? Dino name. And say flex grow 1. And then I'm just not going to put flex grow at all on the other thing, so it won't take any of that extra space. So if I do that, and I refresh, I look at the span again. Now the span takes up all the way up to where the buttons begin. So that was easy. Then I went vertical alignment. There are a lot of alignment-related rules in Flexbox. And Flexbox includes the concept of axes. By default, flex containers are rows, essentially. And the things you put in them are side by side. You can also set them to be columns. But rows is the default, and that's what we're using. If we look at properties for the parent, flex direction, that's how we would change it from columns to rows, or vice versa. Flex wrap, flex flow, justify content would distribute the extra free space between the elements or to one side. Align items defines the default behavior for how flex items are laid out along the cross axis on the current line. So flex containers have a main axis and a cross axis. The cross axis is basically the opposite direction of the direction that your flex container is going. So align items is what we want here if we want to align it vertically. Also on Dino, we can just say, we don't really need that anymore. We can say align items center. When we refresh, looking at the span, it looks like the span is now centered vertically inside there, inside that blue container. It was hugging the top. But the buttons aren't. What's up with that? Let's have a look at them if we're not sure. Let's look at this button group. Remember, if you inspect something, you can see the CSS rules that are applied to it. So the button group, when we hover over it, I see some orange there instead of blue underneath. That means there's some margin. Button group, margin bottom, 1 rim. So we want to get rid of that. To test that, let's uncheck this. And now, yeah, they're centered. So we need to override that rule with our own. So that's, you can see that's coming from Foundations CSS. So if in our CSS we add a rule, that was on button group, that was on class button group. We could make this rule more specific and say something with a class of both actions and a class of button group. And just say margin bottom 0. Refresh. And yep, sure enough. Now look at the LI and everything's good. Now there could probably stand to be a little bit of space in between them. So we'll put some padding on the actual LI. So the Dino. We'll add some padding. I will add 0.75 rim to the top and bottom, 1.25 rim to the left and right. Refresh. Now there's a little space. Again, everything is centered vertically inside there, and will remain that way when we add more stuff to it. So that's pretty nice. Could also go ahead and throw a border on those. So let's say on Dino, border, I'll put at the top, border 1 pixel solid DDD, that's a light gray. See how that looks. Do you see the problem? Does that show up there? In between, the border is 2 pixels. Why? Because the bottom pixel of the one above is right up against the top border of the one below, making those borders too dang thick. How can we fix that? What do you think? We could try leaving the bottom border off of the ones that it should be left off of. We could try leaving the top border off of the ones, or leave the bottom border off of all of them except the one on the very bottom or something. If we just said this for all but the bottom, then these would all look right, but then the bottom one wouldn't have any. And that's a problem. Here's how I'm going to deal with it. So you could use like last child to deal with that. But here's what I want to do. What does that selector mean? Dino plus dino. Do you remember what plus is? Adjacent sibling. So that means something with a class of dino that immediately follows something else with a class of dino. So that would apply to all but the first one. So on all but the first one, we could leave the top border off. Or none. Now, they're all right. Still got a very small problem. Yeah.
Could you say one more time why plus makes it so that top one?
So all of them by default are going to have a 1 pixel border on all sides. Because this selector, just anything with a class of dino is going to match all of them. This rule says anything with a class of dino that immediately follows something else with a class of dino. Adjacent sibling. So this does not immediately follow another one, another dino. So it gets to keep its top border, and we just remove it from all the others. What's going on here? Where'd this come from? Let's inspect it. Inspect it. So it's the template, but we said display none on the template. What gives? Let's look at the CSS. See if we're losing our minds. Aha. Here's template display none, but that's crossed out because .dino has display flex. So what are we going to do about that? Well, no. So the rules are a little complicated for how CSS chooses what rules to apply. It depends on several things, one of which is the order in which they appear in the code. Another of which is how specific the rule is. So, for example, just saying something with a class of dino versus saying something with a class of dino that is an adjacent sibling of another thing with a class of dino, that's more specific. Or saying dot actions versus dot actions dot button group, that's 2 classes instead of 1. So that's, again, a more specific selector. There's a CSS specificity calculator that's kind of handy sometimes if you're wondering why your rules aren't doing what you expect. And that'll be linked from the website. But in this case, what can we do? Well, for one thing, does this need to be inside the list? Not really. So we could just take this whole LI and move it. Sooner or later, that's actually going to save us some other trouble. We could wait on that, though. For right now, that's not actually going to solve this problem. What if we just make this rule more specific? Instead of just .template, what if we say .dyno.template? Even though this display flex down here comes later in the source, this is more specific, so it'll take precedence. If it matches this selector, and they both include rules for the same property, this one's going to win. So if we refresh, now our template is hidden again. So I'm going to say use Flexbox for Dyno layout.